After literally years of members of the community demanding that Call of Duty or Activision explain how their skill-based matchmaking system work, they've finally relented and released a detailed white paper with not only some of the mechanics of how it works, but the reasoning for why it's the best system for the game they have, and the tests they've done to show that some of the things people have asked for in the past are probably a bad idea. And finally, the community is united and happy. Just kidding. The people who have always been anti-skill-based matchmaking have completely dismissed it and even claimed that it's lying or that they know more than the developers do about how the game works. So in this video, and I think it's going to be a long one, let's get stuck into the details about what does this white paper tell us about skill-based matchmaking, what are the popular theories from the community about the system, and what do I think about skill-based matchmaking now that we know a little bit more about it. This is going to get very technical because I want to go in depth with what they've provided, but I will try and make it accessible for everybody. The gameplay in the background is completely random by design. I wanted to just hop onto a solo game and play whatever it gave me, so then you could kind of get a little bit of context for where I'm coming from with all of this, because you can see what my normal lobbies are like. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and let me know your thoughts in the comments below. So let's get started with what does the white paper tell us. Before we begin, it's important to note that the paper is actually talking about multiplayer. I think it's a fair assumption that a lot of the same principles work in Warzone, but there's no guarantee. I'd love for a developer to say like, hey, yeah, this is pretty similar in Warzone, or no, it's completely different. You do need to remember a Warzone match has to organize a lot more players into a lot more teams, so I imagine it's a slightly different beast. But from now on in the video, I'll kind of try to talk about both as we go. The white paper begins by reinforcing something we'd already been told in the other post about matchmaking, that skill is not the primary or secondary factor in matchmaking. The matchmaking system focuses on connection quality and matchmaking time. And it has to, otherwise you get the majority of games with horribly inconsistent ping, players lagging all over the place, or matchmaking times taking minutes between each game, which is likely to encourage a lot of players to just go find something else to do. I know if I hop onto Warzone and the games are taking like 5 minutes to find a match, I'm not going to bother carrying on playing, I'll just do something else. I know loads of people will sit there and say, but Warzone does have terrible lag and inconsistent ping. And for most people it just doesn't, not really. There are definitely issues. I find often if I do like a full play session, so I'm playing for like 3 hours or more, I'll probably have 1 or 2 games where the server seems to stutter a bit. But as a child of the 80s who grew up playing online FPS games since they started basically, it's leagues better than what we used to have, while internet infrastructure surprisingly hasn't changed that much in a way that would help. You often see people moaning that they get lag in games despite having like a gigabit connection with a huge download and upload speed, but that's mostly irrelevant. Games don't use a lot of data in either direction. All that matters is your latency and your jitter. You need your computer to be able to receive the small bits or packets of information from the server as fast as possible, and to be able to send them as fast as possible back to the server. This is a fairly niche use case for the internet. Lots of people are just kind of reading their emails or doing online shopping or watching things like Netflix, where when you're streaming video from Netflix or YouTube or Disney Plus or whatever, the latency doesn't actually matter. It doesn't matter if you get a bunch of the information really quickly and then it slows down for a while, or if it's all paced out evenly. As long as you're getting it faster than you can watch the video, it's all fine. But having a really stable and incredibly low latency is super relevant for online gaming, and probably stock market trading is the only other thing. It's constrained by your physical distance to a server. The slowest connections between your device, the ISP and the server, like you could have the absolute best network set up in your house, but then if there's some sort of problem between your ISP and the server, there's some dodgy connection somewhere, that's going to absolutely ruin it, and you have absolutely no control over it. And it can also be affected by things like the amount of traffic being used by all of those systems. If there's loads of people on your street that are also on your ISP and they're all using the internet at the same time, there's no guarantee that your connection is going to get priority. Some of those packets might get put in a queue, which might only be for, milliseconds at a time, but that adds up over the entire route that these packets need to take. Because gaming is such a niche problem, ISPs don't care about it all that much, and the maximum size of the packets of information going backs and forwards hasn't actually changed in a long while now, and the way these packets are handled isn't prioritized across the network just because you're gaming, except for maybe between your device and your router, depending on what your router is, and that's a relatively minor step in the journey. So developers for years have found ingenious ways to make the most of an aging infrastructure and hide all of those problems that it presents, and they do it in different ways. Some games like Halo have huge amounts of lag compensation, so you hardly ever feel the lag and the delay, but it can lead to some kind of crazy desync like what we saw at the beginning of Halo Infinite, and those weird instances where both players in a fight kill each other at the same time, because as far as the server's concerned, the shots or the hits happen close enough together that they might as well just call it even. Call of Duty has long stood apart from games like that because it feels so snappy. You get immediate feedback on everything you do, and you rarely trade kills with someone because everything is being worked out so fast. And a lot of the time that's kind of being worked out client side, your side is kind of guessing at what's happened, and then the server decides what really happened, and that's why sometimes you get weirdness like being shot when you think you're around a corner and things like that. But generally it feels really fast because it's doing a pretty good job of updating what's happening for absolutely everybody. This means less lag compensation is happening, and you're seeing a slightly more true version of what the server is seeing, at the expense of noticing the effects of bad connections or server problems a lot more than many other games. But despite this, when people are playing Call of Duty, they still tend to have a very low latency to the server and a pretty consistent game experience. Obviously, anecdotally, there will be people who don't have that good experience. They might be playing over Wi-Fi, which adds a huge amount of latency just in your side of it, or have some crazy route between their router and the ISP. Maybe they're a long way away from the cabinet on their street, maybe their cabinet is connected in a super weird way to the kind of server for their ISP, or they might just be in a region where the distances between the steps are absolutely huge. But if you hop around on Twitch and look at a bunch of different streams, loads of streamers have their latency up, or you can kind of just watch their gameplay to get an idea of how it's going. Most people seem to be getting between 10 and 15 milliseconds of latency, which is a pretty incredible achievement for Call of Duty. Like back when I used to play things like Jedi Knight online, which is a weird game, but that was one of the first games that I really got into online, or even the original Call of Duty. It wasn't that unusual to have people on the server with like 200 milliseconds of ping. I remember there being loads of servers in games like Battlefield or the original Call of Duty where people would be like, oh, we'll ban you if your ping is over 200 milliseconds. So to cut that down to a quarter is pretty amazing. Now obviously Activision managed to do this by having loads of servers around the most populated areas of the world. Not everywhere, like not in China, because to work in China you have to use a Chinese company and their deal fell through, so now there's no servers in China. And through aggressively matchmaking based on connection above nearly everything else. And that nearly everything else isn't skill, it's matchmaking time. They've decided that if you have to wait a long time to find a game, you're more likely to quit. And so the game will push to find you a match within a minute or so of you searching. Meaning if there are no available matches with a decent connection to you, maybe because you live in a low population area, or you're playing at off-peak times like you're playing at 4 in the morning, you might get matched into a game where you have a worse connection. Whether that's right or wrong is a bit of personal preference. As a non-competitive player, I'm kind of happy to have shorter matchmaking times, even if some games are a little bit laggier. If you're super competitive, or you live in an area where those lag differences could be absolutely huge, like Australia or South Africa, it could be a bigger problem. Some people get around that with geofencing, so it's a way of making your router only accept connections to servers in their local area, so they'll force the game to wait much longer to find a match, but they'll guarantee that they're getting one near them. Or sometimes, admittedly, some people set the area to somewhere they'll think they'll have easier lobbies to try and cheat the system, but we'll talk about that in quite a lot of detail later. So those two matchmaking factors have priority: connection and how long you've been matchmaking for. The game will try and find a server that has an available game within a minute or two of you searching that you also have a good connection to. Then and only then, once it's found some games where all of that lines up, it will consider skill. This is important because people saying that skill-based matchmaking overrides ping-based matchmaking are just wrong. It's clear from this paper that that doesn't happen. If you're getting worse connections, it's because either you're playing in an area where there just aren't enough games to find, or you've manipulated your connection somehow to stop yourself from connecting to the servers that the game would normally connect you to. So the game finds you the servers it could possibly connect you to, and if there's more than one of them with a suitable match, there's more than one kind of game getting ready to begin that's a suitable match to you, it'll start considering skill to decide who to put into which server. And that's what this white paper is really talking about. So the way they work out skill turns out to be something very similar to ELO, which is what I predicted in my other video. It's something that's been used for a long while in all sorts of matchmaking, so in things like chess and in sports, but also in video games. Basically, they assign all players a number between two constrained values, kind of 0 and 1 as far as I can tell from this document, which does lead to an interesting situation because there might be someone who is the peak COD player and they might have the highest possible skill rating, like the best COD player in the world should have a skill rating of 1, and on the other end there should be someone who has the 0 skill rating. Answers on a postcard as to who that might be. They do this because it makes it easy to compare players within teams. Obviously you can just use maths to compare them very simply. When you enter a match, the game uses these numbers to try and make the teams balanced, and we'll talk a bit more about how it does that later. Obviously this is trickier when players are in parties, but it does try to do it. Then at the end of the match, it compares your performance against everybody else in that game, and also against how well the system expected you to do. If you do better than it expected you to do, it moves your skill rating up. If you do worse, then it moves it down. So if you're in a lobby filled with players who are much better than you, but you do okay, you don't necessarily win, but you do okay, your skill rating will increase dramatically because the system expected you to have a rough game. If you're in a lobby of people much worse than you, but you absolutely dominate them, it won't actually move at all because that's what the system expected to happen. It's all about finding a system that can predict how well you're going to do in any given game. It's important that this system's flexible and has a lot of movement built into it, because people can play better or worse in different sessions. Sometimes when I'm streaming, I might be talking to chat loads and barely paying attention to the game, and so I'll be playing really badly. And then other times I'll be downstairs on a sofa, but I'll be on my big TV, I'll be in a party with my friends where we're all communicating, I'll be completely dialed in, and we'll all be trying to win. The system can account for that just by changing your skill rating quickly. Rather than you just having a skill rating that follows you around forever, if it's quite versatile, if it's quite dynamic, then it can be like, oh, okay, you're playing quite well today, we're going to set you at this skill level. It's also worth noting that they point out in this paper, your rating doesn't have anything to do with your progression, so like your XP or your level or anything like that, or your time played, and as far as I can tell, it doesn't have anything to do with like what you've bought from the store or anything like that either. What is exactly measured to work out how well you're playing in a game is dependent on the mode. For something like Team Deathmatch, it's considering your kill-death ratio, but it's also doing things like ignoring your self-kills to stop reverse boosting, and it considers how long you've spent in the game, because, you know, if you get 10 kills in a minute, that's much more impressive than if you get 10 kills in 10 minutes. The big focus is just finding a method to track a player's skill that can change over time, is specific to every mode, so you being good at domination won't necessarily cross over into you being good at search and destroy, and it can accurately predict how well a player can do in the next match. If it's doing a good job of predicting performance, then it's working, so for each mode they develop different methods that achieve that. If it's not doing a good job of predicting, then they can tweak it, and I think it sounds like from this paper, they change things all the time. Like they go back and they look at it, and they change how it works all the time for all the different modes, all the different playlists, and that might explain why when we get a new limited time mode that's quite different to anything we've had before, often it will seem like there's no skill-based matchmaking at first, because the system's taking a while to work out what they should be measuring, what's working, and everyone's taking a bit of time for the system to work out how good they are at that mode. In the document, they explain why they're using skill for matching. They say, and I quote, "Players of all levels should have a fun and competitive experience with the game. That means the game isn't just tuned around the most hardcore dedicated players. It's designed to work well for people who just play occasionally, or who don't take it too seriously, or who just aren't that good at the game. And I think some content creators in the kind of community space forget about that. They think that the game should just be for the people who are super dedicated to Call of Duty, that it should be designed around the most hardcore because they know what's best for the game. But that couldn't be further from the truth. The game is designed around having as many people as possible. And obviously, that's an important side of the business. They want as many people as possible to play Call of Duty. I always find it really difficult to take people seriously when they argue that they should be rewarded for their practice and their devotion for Call of Duty. It's a video game. No one needed you to try and get good at it. No one asked you to try and get good at it. You being good at the game doesn't mean you deserve to be able to ruin the experience of other people who are playing it more casually. It's like back in the days of playing split-screen games or local multiplayer games, you know, when your friends would come around your house and you'd all play a game together on the same TV, and you'd play things like Street Fighter 2 or Mario Kart. I used to play GoldenEye 4-player. I was lucky enough to have a group of friends, and there were a bit more than 4 of us, and we would meet up fairly regularly, all go around someone's house, and we would play split-screen GoldenEye. We were all about as good as each other, so it was always a really good time. But over the months, one player got much better than the rest of us, to the point where eventually we just didn't stand a chance against him. If he was in the game, he was definitely going to win. There was like no questions asked. He knew about all the little tricks that you could do. He knew which weapons are better. He knew which control setup was best, and he'd practiced being able to get headshots really quickly. We weren't super happy with him and like congratulating him for being such a great GoldenEye pro. We were just fed up that the games were less fun now, so we just didn't invite him as much, or if he was around, we'd go play Diddy Kong Racing or something. The same is now happening with online gaming, except we're not going to play Diddy Kong Racing, we're all going to play like extraction shooters or some sort of PvE co-op game, because it's just not that much fun playing PvP against the people who take it way too seriously. A large majority of the audience for Call of Duty treat it as a bit of fun. They mess around with their friends, and of course they want to do well while they're playing, but they're not going to dedicate time to practice or find the perfect settings for their controllers and platforms or watch YouTube videos to learn the best strategies and glitches to exploit. I think there's a big misunderstanding with the Call of Duty community where people think that, you know, casuals as they get called don't want to win, that they don't care about winning, so why does it matter what's going on with them? In my experience, they do want to win, they do want to do well while they're playing, they just don't care enough about winning to turn it into a job. But when some people do decide that being good at Call of Duty is super important to them and they do all those things, they spend hours practicing, they watch all the streamers and the YouTube videos and they know all the little exploits, they know everything about the meta, they're suddenly a lot less fun to play with. In an ideal world, strict skill-based matchmaking would keep these different kinds of players away from each other. You'd have like brand new players or players with accessibility needs who can play in one bracket, people who just play the game for fun can play against each other in a kind of middle bracket, and people who take it super seriously could all play against each other in the top bracket. The problem with that is that the players who take it super seriously don't feel rewarded for their effort. In my opinion, I don't care about them. Again, no one asked you to get ridiculously good at a video game. But if these people find themselves struggling because they're now up against other good players, they seem to start trying to find sneaky ways to get put against players worse than them. And this has happened in every kind of game that I've ever played that's PvP that has any kind of skill-based matchmaking. The top players don't like the fact that they can't win every game, so instead they try and get into the other ones by making Smurf accounts where they make a new account and purposefully get it bad stats so they can get into easier games, or they're like lower level in an MMORPG like World of Warcraft or something like that. And they do that so they can dominate and feel good about all that time they spent learning the game. Of course, this isn't fun for anyone else in the game, so it turns out to be a pretty selfish thing to do. In the white paper, Call of Duty shares a diagram showing a feedback loop, and it's something that I've talked about quite a lot in videos and on stream, where if lower skill players play less because they just keep losing all the time, you know, they want to quit, they don't want to keep on getting beaten, so they're just like, oh, I'll go play something else, the average skill level rises, which then means people who used to be average are now below average because the average of all the players has gone up because the worst players have left. And then that means that the players that were average are now below average, and so they're more likely to quit because they don't like losing more and more. And this loop continues until eventually you're only left with the most hardcore players. And then all of them will just be complaining that the game is too sweaty and skill-based matchmaking is too strict because they can't win games. And this, I think, is what's happening to Call of Duty right now. I think lots of people who were playing it quite casually have just stopped playing because they lose all of the time. It's no fun, especially in something like Warzone, where you have to sit through the matchmaking, then sit through the pre-game lobby, then sit through that god-awful cutscene with Graves, and then you drop into a game, and then you might just get killed off the rip, get killed in the gulag, and then you get the fun of doing all of that again. That's no fun at all. If that's the sort of experience you're having, you're pretty likely to quit the game. The writers of this paper, remember they're talking about multiplayer mostly, explain that blowouts are clearly not fun for players on the losing end, you know, when one team absolutely destroys the other team. So they try to make the matches as fair as possible. And when they do that, using skill-based matchmaking, it results in 80 to 90% of players having a better time, and therefore sticking with the game longer and quitting less. Now that does mean that the top 10% are having a worse time because of skill-based matchmaking, because they're not winning as much as they'd like to. But that's probably a better solution than the other way around of doing things for that top 10% and then punishing the other 90%. The paper does also talk about building teams. A common complaint from players is that the enemy team's always amazing and their team is always terrible. Activision's data shows that even a slightly better party is much more likely to win if they're all playing together. So like a party as in, you know, you join up with your friends and then you get match made into a bigger team in multiplayer, or you get match made in Warzone, so it's like your party against a load of people who are randoms. If your party is even slightly better than the average, they end up being way more likely to win. It kind of skews way more in their favor. They give the example that, again, in multiplayer, a 6-player party that's just in the 60th skill percentile, so a team that's made up of players that are just better than 60% of the players, but worse than 40% of players, would still be more likely to win against 80% of all randomly created teams. In another example, if you have a game of 2 teams of 6, if every single player in that game, so 11 out of the 12 players, are at the 50th percentile, so they're perfectly average, they are better than half of the other players and worse than half the other players, but just one player is an 80th percentile player, the team that gets that player now has an over 70% chance of winning. Now, these are all statistics. These are all things that they have researched. They have the data to back them up. So this is what's happening in reality. And I think a lot of the arguments about skill-based matchmaking come from anecdotes and people's feelings. Obviously, Activision and Call of Duty are the only people that have the real data. And this is what they're saying is happening. That there is a massive imbalance if you have a party with good players or you have one good player in a game full of average players. The effect it has is way bigger than you might expect. And that means balancing around these players, these better players, has to be quite careful to avoid them just always winning and anyone coming up against them always losing. Activision also explained that they have always been doing testing of different methods of matchmaking and making skill-based matchmaking more or less important. And it sounds like their ability to do this kind of large-scale testing has been much easier since Modern Warfare 2019. So in 2024, the first part of this year, they ran a deprioritized skill test in Modern Warfare 3. And the scale of it was astounding, but I guess there was no other way they could really do it. They took 50% of all North American players and loosened skill-based matchmaking for them. The other half were left with it running completely as normal. And that accounts for things like how much fun the game was in that particular season, or what modes were available then, because they had a control group on the exact same season and modes, in the same region. They mentioned that in player surveys there's a strong correlation between people who are saying they're having less fun with the people that are quitting matches or not returning to play within 14 days. That is common sense, but I've heard content creators claiming that this test doesn't have anything to do with how much players are enjoying the game. It clearly does, like they address that directly in the white paper. They ran this test for a month, so 50% of all North American players in some month in the beginning of this year didn't have strict skill-based matchmaking. It was severely loosened, and half of the other players just had it as normal. It's kind of shocking that no one knew that this was happening. You know, people talk so much about how they can tell what's going on with skill-based matchmaking. I didn't see anyone saying, hey, remember that month when suddenly it was a lot easier? But anyway, they ran a test for a month, and they found that for 90% of players in a group with less skill-based matchmaking, the group where they had it loosened, they were significantly less likely to return to play again within 14 days, compared to players in a control group of a similar skill. The top 10% were the only players more likely to want to come back and play more than the control group. Now remember, this isn't comparing the 10% to the 90% in terms of who's more likely to come back and play. Obviously the top 10% are more likely to play more because they're really good at the game, they play a lot anyway. This is comparing the test group to the control group. I've seen a ton of bad takes in videos and in tweets where people are massively misinterpreting these numbers. But yeah, it's not comparing the top players to the bottom players in terms of, oh, okay, who decided to play more? It's comparing the people who had skill-based matchmaking loosened and the people who didn't have skill-based matchmaking loosened, but staying within each percentile of skill. And with that happening, so 90% of people having a worse time, I guess, being more likely to quit, being less likely to come back, and only the top 10% being more likely to play, that causes the precise effect that was described in that feedback loop earlier. If 90% of the players at the lower end are more likely to quit, and the top 10% are more likely to keep playing, the overall player base will shrink, and the average skill level will rise dramatically, because it's just the good players who are left, until soon a top 10 player won't be a top 10 player anymore. They'll be a top 20 player or a top 30 player. And then they'll start having that effect of, oh, this isn't as much fun. I'm losing a lot more than I used to. And so then they'll quit, and it makes the problem worse and worse because the average skill level will keep on rising. This is bad for Activision because less people are playing the game, and it's bad for players because your games will get more difficult and less fun, even if you're currently in the top end. They also ran an experiment doing the opposite of this. They tightened skill-based matchmaking for one group and left it the same for the other group, and it had the opposite results. 90% of players were more likely to play more, while the top 10% were more likely to stop playing. They said they decided not to roll this out because they thought that was unfair on the top 10%. They decided that they wanted to have a bit more balance, but they are going to go into a bit more detail about all of these tests in future. They also provide a lot of other detail about how loosening skill-based matchmaking increased the number of blowouts where one team dominates the other, which went up by as much as 10%, and the difference in kills per minute, which dropped by 10% for the weakest players and rose by 4% for the top players. Score per minute in other modes like domination and stuff had a similar trend. Basically, all of these results show that loosening skill-based matchmaking only benefits the top 10% of players, but negatively affects everyone else to a much more severe degree than that top 10% sort of gain. And then, as we've discussed, some of those people in that top 10% would end up not being in the top 10% anymore because the player base shrinks and the average skill level gets higher. For a player, the main takeaway should probably be one that you could learn just from common sense. Don't go out of your way to get good at the game. You're going to have less fun. Just play it at whatever skill level you're at and enjoy yourself, and you'll probably have a better time. Activision also compared different Call of Duty titles. They acknowledged that some have tighter or looser skill-based matchmaking, because it has a focus on different modes, or the maps are different, or the way weapons or score streaks work. They found that in the games with a lower skill matching, so the sort of like looser skill-based matchmaking, the weakest players will lose 90% of the time. In the games with the much tighter skill-based matchmaking, they only lose 75% of the time. That means they're more likely to experience the fun of winning and stick with the game, which, as explained earlier, is a positive for everyone in the community. Imagine if you pick up a new game and you only win 1 in 10 games. You could play like 8 games in a row and lose every single one. It'd be much better if maybe you won 1 in 4 games. That's going to give you a little bit of a taste of it. That's going to give you a feeling, okay, yeah, this is possible. I can do it. So even though the worst players will still obviously lose more games, they at least won some. And an important note in this section is that for the top players, they still win 70% of more of their games, even with the tightest matchmaking. Loads of content creators try to like dramatize these kind of results by taking them to some crazy theoretical maximum, saying skill-based matchmaking seeks to keep everybody at a 1 kill death or a 1 win-loss ratio. In practice, skill-based matchmaking doesn't flatten it out that much. As they say in the white paper, it just reduces the severity of the slope. Good players are still more likely to win. The paper points out that skill disparity is not the top priority of the matchmaking system. Connection and matchmaking time is. Skill disparity is just a part of it. The skill-based matchmaking is like the third thing on the list. And the paper goes on to describe that these tests aren't new. In Modern Warfare 2019, they did a test similar to the deprioritized skill test, and the player counts dropped in the test group significantly. They also did a test where only the bottom 25% of players had tight matchmaking, while the top 75% had it loosened, and that's something I've heard a few people suggest as a possible thing, saying like, okay, protect the weakest players, but then let everyone else fight against each other. This still had clear negative effects on the player counts, and therefore how much fun the people were having. People stopped playing the game when they ran that test. While so far the paper's been sort of quite high level in terms of the philosophy of what they're trying to do with matchmaking, it does go on to give some surprisingly fine detail about how it actually works. So in the next bit of video, I'm going to go through that, and then we'll get on to kind of addressing what the community says about all of this. So in a section about skill grouping, they explain that there's 3 systems that overlap for matchmaking, and these are kind of the actual systems that are running on servers to try and work it out. One takes into account your geographical location as a way to try and focus on connection. It uses the Great Circle Distance, which is basically you plot coordinates on a sphere and then you work out across the surface of the Earth what's the shortest distance between them. You kind of have to do that, because if you did it on a straight line, you'd get some weird effect where like people on the opposite side of the world would seem to be closer than people who are like halfway around it. It's very, very strange. But it's a sensible way of judging how close people are, which is usually a fairly good measure for how good their connections will be. Not always. There are some places in the world where that doesn't work very well, but that's what they use. It then uses your skill rating as a value between 0 and 1, which represents your average skill, and it also looks at what input device you're using. The weighting is set up so when players are close geographically, then the next step is to find out which of those players have a similar skill, and then input device is used after that. So these values are compared to other players who are searching every 5 seconds. So from when you press the matchmaking button, from then, the server will get a list of everybody who's searching every 5 seconds, and then all the players that have numbers that are quite close to each other, which implies they're close geographically, they're close in terms of skill level, and maybe they're more likely to all be on controller or all be on keyboard and mouse, then it will pass them off, sort of separate them, and then the matchmaking system will try and put them in a lobby together. It is important to note, and I want to make this as clear as possible, it is insanely weighting your connection, your geographical location, so it tries to focus on that as much as possible, and then it's worrying about skill. The system sounds like it would probably be similar for Warzone if it's iterating over the list of players searching every 5 seconds. Obviously, it's only able to put you up against players who are searching in the same window. If there's no one available who's a suitable match, rather than just throwing you into a terrible match, it will broaden the values a little. So it'll say, okay, let's broaden the connection area a little bit. And then it'll keep doing it a little bit more every time it fails, increasing exponentially, so you don't end up waiting too long. Like by the time you've been waiting for a couple of minutes, by then it'll basically be like, okay, just put them in whatever game we can find. This means the matchmaking system is doing its best to match you based on connection, then skill, then input. But obviously it can only match you against the people who are searching. So if you've cut off possible connections via geofencing, or you're in a super low population area, you're more likely just to get put in whatever lobby is available and needs players, which results in much looser skill-based matchmaking, which benefits the top 10%, which is why a lot of streamers do that, and then is bad for the other 90% of people in those lobbies. And in a way, as we've explained earlier, because of the cycle, it's bad for everybody if that happens, because that kind of behavior, that kind of activity where the best players are getting thrown into matches with everyone else, that will lead to people quitting. In a Warzone game where you've got loads and loads of people playing, it doesn't take many good players to completely ruin that game. If you're in a party, they've confirmed that they do use an average of your party, which is something I know people had wondered about quite a lot. But they also make it stricter if there's more disparity. So they give the example of a party of 2, where one player is a complete average player and one player is elite. The, like 99% percentile, they'll be at the very top. If they both get put into the average player's normal lobbies, the elite player will dominate every single game. If they put both of them into the elite player's lobbies, then the average player will be the worst player in every single game. So both those solutions seem to be pretty bad. So they need to try and put them somewhere in the middle, preferably against other parties with a similar skill disparity. And that's quite difficult because there's not going to be many other people searching. If they just said, okay, we're going to put them in the middle and we're going to put them in people in like the 75th percentile, then what happens is you still have the issue of the average player losing every fight they're in and doing really badly, and you still have the problem of the elite player doing really, really well. So they can't do that either. Instead, they look at that disparity. They look at the fact that, okay, these people have like a 50% disparity. They've got a really good player and a really bad player. We need to find other parties where there's a really good player and a really bad player and try and group them up together. But like I said, that is very difficult. So it tries to put them against each other where there's likely to be a group of elite players and a group of average players. So everyone has a chance of getting into fair gunfights, while other teams that might be of a similar skill level, like I said, teams that are all at the 75th percentile, where all the players in their team are at 75th percentile, they'll probably play against each other because then it'll be fair for them too. So the idea is to try and keep these sort of groups that have high skill disparity out of the general matchmaking a little bit. And it explains a little bit why people who play Warzone and are playing in parties where one player is really good and one player is really bad, why they often think, oh, we're getting thrown into really hard lobbies. Because as I've said before, in Warzone, if there's a really good player in the game, they are going to dominate. Like, really good players can absolutely destroy a game of Warzone for everybody else. So that means all of the kind of bad players that are the friends of the really good players that have come along, they're going to really struggle because they probably won't find each other to fight. That's just how Warzone works. Bad players don't tend to find each other. Really good players tend to find everybody. But again, this requirement of looking at a disparity between people within a party has to be loosened over the matchmaking time so people don't wait too long to find a game. Basically, all this means is if you play in a party with a wide range of skill levels, you should come up against other parties with a wide range of skill levels, if there are enough searching at that time. If you're in a party with similar skill levels, you should get matched up against other parties with similar skill levels. Team balance is the next part of the white paper, and another thing that I think people thought was kind of interesting before this came out, and it explains that during the matchmaking, the system does try to make it possible to balance the teams in a match that's created. So they always want to make sure there'll be the same number of players on each team, and they try to make the whole matchmaking process a little bit more complicated through that, because it's like, oh, you can't just put whichever parties together, because there might be a party of 4, and then a party of 2, and then a party of 1, then a party of 3. So the system has like another thing to try and work out to group people up together, but that is super important. They won't kind of compromise on that. It will always try to make sure teams have the same number of people on each team, which does make it trickier for odd-sized parties to find a game. But then the game finds an arrangement within the lobby for the 2 teams with the lowest possible skill differential. That means you might have one good player and a lot of bad players on one team, but since the system will register that that is a high skill disparity, it should have put you up against another team that also has maybe one good player and a bunch of bad players, or 2 good players and a bunch of bad players. You might not notice that because you might just keep coming against the best players. That's kind of what happens in Call of Duty, and you'll feel hard done by, but that is what the system is trying to do. The paper goes on to explain that often those disparate parties where you've got a really good player and a really bad player, they tend to actually have a higher average skill level. So you're more likely to find an average and an elite player playing together compared to an average and a poor player, or a very poor player and an elite player. This means that matchmaking at the higher end of skill actually needs a higher population to find good matches, because there's going to be more of these parties where the matchmaking system has to try and find other disparate skill matchings to put them against. And that means that people with a higher skill are slightly more likely to have to wait longer to find a game. Although the difference in their data is about 5 seconds, with most games being found, again, multiplayer, most games being found in 15 to 20 seconds. But the system does do a good job of ensuring a consistent average ping across skill levels. So whether you're really good at the game or really bad at the game, most people seem to have a sort of average latency of 15 to 35 milliseconds. Weirdly, the best players, the highest skill level players, tend to have a slightly lower ping. That might be because the players who have a better connection to nearby servers or who play in high population areas maybe play more and have better feedback on their actions so they can get better at the game easier, but it's quite a small difference. Anyway, that is the whole white paper. I personally found it super interesting, and I'm impressed that they've given us so much specific data. But let's address some of the common things I've heard in the community about this paper and skill-based matchmaking. First of all, this is just looking at player retention and not how much people enjoy the game. I've heard this a few times on Twitter particularly. They do directly address this in the paper. I mentioned it earlier. In their own research where they used player surveys, they found a strong correlation between the easy to measure data, like how long do people play for, how likely are they to quit after each match, how likely are they to come back and play again within 14 days, and those much harder to measure things like how much fun they're having. Therefore, they see it as reasonable to equate these two things to a degree, while recognizing that they are different. Now, they, again, have access to all this data, and we don't. I mean, other than outside of these white papers. So I'm inclined to believe them that, yes, whether or not someone is enjoying the game will often be reflected in how much they play, how often they play, and stuff like that. In my experience at least, I tend to play a game more when I'm enjoying it. Of course, you can get trapped in grinds and enticed back with daily login rewards and battle pass progression, but in the experiments we were talking about earlier for skill-based matchmaking, there was a control group of half of the population of North America who were playing the game, and they would have also had those factors like the battle pass and daily login rewards and stuff like that. So for the sake of the experiments, they cancel out because that's kind of what a control group is for. The second thing I hear is, really, they're using engagement optimized matchmaking, which isn't mentioned in this paper at all, but is in patents. I often hear this from kids and, those people that seem a bit like conspiracy theorists. I did a whole video about engagement optimized matchmaking, and I still get some weird comments about it. But in that, I went through the paper from the people that designed the system and what it was for, which was 1v1 games. They even say they're not sure how well it would work for games that weren't 1v1. And in that video, I talk about how it doesn't really make sense in a game like Warzone. I'll link that video at the end of this one. But still, this idea keeps coming back. At this point, I'm convinced no amount of evidence or reasoning to counter the argument will ever satisfy the people who think EOMM, or engagement optimized matchmaking, is somehow being used to manipulate whether they win or lose each game of Warzone. It's pretty simple to understand. In each game of Warzone, only 0.8 to 4% of the players, depending on the mode, can win. That means if the system was completely fair and skill-based matchmaking was entirely strict, you should only expect to win that much. Obviously, the ability of some players to win much more than that shows that the system isn't perfect, because for every extra game you win, someone else is losing the one that they should have won. There's not enough people playing the game for any kind of perfect matchmaking, let alone a system as convoluted as EOMM, or engagement optimized matchmaking, would be in a battle royale game. Now, whether or not there's engagement optimized matchmaking in multiplayer, they haven't mentioned it at all in this, and I'm not entirely sure why they'd hide it, because to reasonable people, it doesn't even sound like a bad thing. The idea that sometimes if you're on a run of bad games, they'll throw you a game that's a bit easier just to kind of, keep you playing, keep you a little bit more optimistic. That doesn't sound like a terrible thing, I think, to normal, reasonable people. But they haven't mentioned it at all, which leads me to think it's not being used in this, because why would they need to? Now, the third thing that I've seen a lot about in response to this white paper is, this isn't my experience, this isn't what's happened to me, and it's worth noting that everything in the paper is based on averages and big data. If you live somewhere like Australia, South Africa, or Argentina, it's going to be much harder for any matchmaking system to find good games for you, simply because of the distances involved and the player populations. Similarly, if you play at off-peak times, it'll be much harder for the game to find other people for you to play with. The Call of Duty player population has shrunk dramatically since the peak of Warzone in 2020 or 2021. And the more it shrinks, the more likely you are to get matched into games with players of a different skill level to you, or with a worse connection with a server that's further away. The solution is to get more people playing, and this paper clearly shows that stricter skill-based matchmaking leads to more people sticking with the game, and looser skill-based matchmaking, or removing it entirely, leads to the player base shrinking even more. The next thing I've heard a few times is that Activision is lying, and I'm not even really sure how to argue against that, because whatever I say, they're just going to say, oh, you're a shill for Activision. I mean, you should check out some of my other videos lately. I'm definitely not. But the easiest answer is kind of, why would they bother? They have a goal of trying to get as many people to play Call of Duty as possible, and to get them to keep playing it for as long as possible, because, you know, that's how they make money. If you're playing it for a long time, you're more likely to buy microtransactions, more likely to get the battle pass, you're going to buy the games when they come out. I assume most Call of Duty fans also hope that the game is worth buying and worth playing as much as you want to. So we're kind of aligned with Activision on that. We both want the same thing. We want a game that we want to play, and we want to play for a long time. So what reason do they have to lie about how this works? Everything they've said in the paper makes complete logical sense, and it's all stuff that I said when I was just speculating in the skill-based matchmaking video I did before, because I was like, okay, this is what we know, so this is what would make sense, and it's turned out all of that stuff was right. There weren't really any surprises in this. So that kind of makes me think, oh, so maybe this is just a little bit more likely? All the alternatives that people put forward to somehow make out that they're being unfairly treated just don't hold up to any scrutiny. Like most conspiracy theories, they're far more complicated and unlikely than a really simple truth. There's just not enough players, when you take into account all the different regions, modes and playlists, for matchmaking to be an effective tool at doing anything particularly clever. Most of the time, the system's grasping desperately to try and get enough people to start a game without horrendous lag, and it's kind of a miracle that most of the time it works. And the last thing from people I hear is that they should make a playlist without skill-based matchmaking. Activision actually directly addresses this in a slightly separate question and answer thing that they've got before the link to this white paper. And they say that only the best players would end up playing it, and that kind of defeats the point. Why would low-level players want to go up against people who are much better than them? You'd just end up with a playlist where only the best players are playing, which is kind of what those best players would be getting in normal matchmaking anyway. Anecdotally again, that's what happened in StarCraft 2. There is a casual playlist on StarCraft 2, and only the best people would be playing it. Every time I went in it, I would end up going up against some crazy people. I actually ended up playing against one of the Korean pros on the casual playlist in a beta test for, I think it was the last expansion, because that's where they could go, where they could maybe not be playing against other Korean pros, but normal people wouldn't ever want to go in there really. In my opinion, skill-based matchmaking is clearly a good thing when it works, and it's a shame that Warzone's in a state where it just can't work as well. One of the main culprits, in my experience, is those players who are very high skill, or players who are cheating, so are giving the appearance of being high skill, getting into games where they don't belong. If a high skill player gets matched into a lobby of average players, they will dominate and ruin that match for everybody else. Warzone has so few winners and such huge games that a single player out of place can have a huge impact on a lot of other people. Sometimes this is happening through top players using things like geofencing to force the matchmaking system to put them in less ideal matches, often against a more kind of random group of players. The top player then has an amazing time and they can dominate the match, they can win, they can get incredible kill streaks, while everyone else has a miserable time and probably will just stop playing. This in turn makes it harder for those top players to find a match they can show off in, or they get matched more against cheaters who don't fit in the usual matchmaking system either, so are more likely to end up getting matched together. They then mistakenly blame skill-based matchmaking or the skill gap or some other aspect of the game. Sometimes those top players are just in a league of their own, so they can't be matched up against people of their own skill level, because not enough of them are playing at any given time, so they still get thrown into those general lobbies and cause the same problems. Those top players are causing most of the issues Warzone is facing, in my opinion, particularly the content creators that are insanely good and also have some influence over the studios in terms of what they're saying about the games and what they're praising and what they're making videos condemning. Normal players don't like being beaten by these people, so more and more of them resort to cheating, while other players just quit playing, and that shrinks the player population even further, which makes the matchmaking struggle even worse. The content creators who are also top players constantly push for a higher skill gap to separate themselves even more from the general population, making the issue even worse. And I think we've clearly seen that in Modern Warfare 3, where there was a huge push saying that, oh, Modern Warfare 2, the skill gap was too small, we couldn't show off enough. Now Modern Warfare 3, this is amazing. You know, when Modern Warfare 3 came out and Warzone started going back to being a bit more like what Warzone 1 was like, all of these content creators were praising and saying, oh, this is amazing. And you know what I said then? This is going to put off a lot of normal people, and there's only going to be the top players left, and then they'll all complain about having to play against each other. And that's what's happened. In my mind, there's only two solutions, other than obviously just banning people as cheats if they're found to be manipulating matchmaking using third-party tools like WZ Agent or geofencing. You could either reduce the skill gap massively by focusing on RNG in terms of loot, so get rid of loadouts and go back to ground loot like in Blackout, and increase the RNG in things like aiming, so get rid of the predictable recoil like on the new SMG, so people can't learn recoil patterns, or have stronger aim assist so there's less of a skill gap between someone who's really good at aiming or someone who's really bad at aiming, to reduce that advantage of highly skilled players that they have in a general lobby. Or, as an alternative, they can make skill-based matchmaking much, much stricter and remove the ability for the top players to get into normal lobbies if they've been waiting too long. Maybe that would lead to them having incredibly long matchmaking times, and I guess that would probably lead them to making Smurf accounts to try and get into other lobbies quicker, or they'd reverse boost or something. But if you had players who were detected as being super good at the game, you could just cut them off and have like a hard separation for that top 10% and say, you guys can only play against each other. Again, anecdotally, going back to things like StarCraft and Heroes of the Storm, this is something that Blizzard used to do quite a lot, where when you had the ranked modes, which were the main modes that people played, the top players had a really hard time finding games and would often end up playing games against people they knew because the rest of the population were protected from them. I know some content creators have called for the bottom 10% of Call of Duty players to be protected from the rest. It should be the other way around. The top 10% should be cut off, and then the other 90% can play against each other. Right now, the situation where some players are able to regularly get nukes, win streaks, or insane kill streaks is a clear sign that skill-based matchmaking isn't working well enough, and that's causing the player population to plummet. I suppose the other solution is just for people to stop trying to get so good at Call of Duty that they ruin it for everyone else. Then they could just treat it like a video game. But for some reason that sounds crazy to people. If you made it this far into the video, thank you so much. Please leave a like, consider subscribing, and let me know in the comments. Just say I made it in the comments and then I'll know who you are.